Yeah, well, good afternoon, everyone. It's really great to be here. I was really happy because yesterday my technicians in Churchill sent me a picture of the weather, and it was basically a white screen. So I was like, this morning I got up and it was all sunny. I took a picture out the window and sent it back to them. Yes, payback. So Steve and I have been working on the Climate Change at Arctic's Edge project since about 2002. Some of you may know the past PI, Dr. Peter Kershaw, who's retired as a scientist and left the project in our hands, but we've been working on the project for about the last 12 years together. So we put up a really long title for you, but basically we want to show a bit about how citizen science has really supported our research in a really cool place. So what does that really mean? Well, as the presenter said, it's the Climate Change at the Arctic's Edge project. This year, in 2014, we hosted 10 research teams at our field site, and we do operate year-round. So we do teams both in the summertime, which are based around wetlands for the most part. Steve does some tree line work as well. And then we do the really cool part, which is our winter teams, where we take volunteers and we shove them out into the winter and say, come on along with us and do science. And so this has been a really exciting endeavor to follow through with this particular project.
All right, thanks for having us, everybody. So I'm going to throw up a graph that a lot of people are probably fairly familiar with, so I won't bore you with it too long. But this is a record of global temperatures. So we've got temperature departures on the Y, and then they go back to 1880, all the way up to, this is the most current, I think, off the web. And the thing that jumps out right away is that we have this warming present, and it's been particularly prevalent in the last 30 years or so. And so this is all fine and dandy. We can't argue, things are warming. All right, we're all in agreement with that. But what we're really interested in is the environmental change that's occurring in the Arctic, because the Arctic is one of those particularly sensitive ecosystems because it's in sort of well, we're actually in the subarctic, we'll just keep that between us, that it's actually a transition between these warm and cold environments. So you'd expect for that transition to be sensitive and might fluctuate in time. So we had to put up the obligatory polar bear on an ice cube because we're in the Arctic and people kind of expect that now.
And especially when you start to think about Churchill, Manitoba. Most times if you say Churchill, I roll in and say, hey, I'm from Churchill. Everyone goes, thank you. Try again. I'm from Churchill. Thank you. So do we study polar bears? No, we actually don't study polar bears as part of our project, but it's often a draw. We put the obligatory polar bear shot in for you. But where is Churchill? Some people aren't even entirely sure where it is. Now, this map is a polar projection, so it's like you're looking down on the North Pole of the planet. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a hint because I know it's a kind of nap time after lunchtime. The giant pink area at the bottom that says Canada, it's somewhere in there. All right, so everyone think about where you think Churchill is. In the middle of the country is Hudson Bay. Maybe you can point that out. Oh, Steve put the arrow up already. Good. So Hudson Bay is the large...
Nobody saw anything.
What else did you put in this presentation that I wasn't looking? All right, so now you know where Churchill is. So it's located on the west coast of Hudson Bay.
I'm going to go. You got this? Okay.
And it's a zone of transition, and I'm going to show you a few photos in a minute to give you a sense of what we mean when we say a zone of transition. Now, I said we do 10 teams a year. We actually do one team that's in the Mackenzie Mountains, which is in Northwest Territories, and it's also located in a transition zone, but an elevational one. Today, we're just going to talk about our Churchill project and really focus on that particular work.
Okay, so we know that global air temperatures are changing, and what we like to do is we like to keep track of temperature with our own stations. And so this first graph that I put up is mean annual air temperatures since we started keeping record since about 2000. So here's one of our Met stations. We measure wind, we power it with solar. There's a temperature, there's a thermometer in here, more wind, and then we have thermometers below ground so we can measure below ground temperatures. And when you first look at this graph, you just want to see trends jump out and be able to say something, but we've only got about 14 years of data, so we're only halfway to that 30-year climate norm. So it's a little bit tenuous to try to say anything about trends at this point because For example, if you were only recording data up to, say, 2004, you'd say, oh, things are cooling in Churchill. But then if you look at the next couple of years, oh, no, they're warming. And then, oh, they're cooling. Oh, we have no idea what's going on. So the only thing that jumps out at this point from this short record is that there's a lot of variability. There's over 14 years, there's about 6 degrees of variability in mean annual temperatures. And so even though we know temperatures are warming when we have a longer term record, a short record like this at this point doesn't show that. And so these are a bunch of different air temperature records from different ecosystems. So we've got forests, we've got fens, which are a type of wetland, we've got tree islands, which occur in between the forest and the tundra, and they all show the same thing, that we've got this sort of pattern in air temperature. So that's air temperature. When you go below ground, it turns into a much different story, that we've got a lot of variability. So you can see here's the 0 line right here. So there's some areas that are consistently below 0, so that means that they've got permanent ground frost. There's permafrost there, because they're frozen between a winter, 2 summers and an intervening winter. And then there's some areas without permafrost, and they're constantly above 0 degrees. But you see there's quite a spread. So just based on the vegetation and the moisture, even though you've got very similar air temperatures among these different sites, that you can get dramatically different subsurface temperatures. And then if you want to squint your eyes, I don't want to shoot myself in the foot, but it does look like there are some positive trends in some of these, but ask us again in 15 years. So we're very interested in climate change, or I guess since we don't have that 30-year blip, we're still measuring weather, but we're very interested in how this sort of abiotic, how the climate and weather affect the biotic, or the living component of the landscape. So we like to wear sandals in the snow sometimes, and a smile that won't wash away. Anyway.
So where are we in Churchill, or what does it look like? So during the summertime, this is what the open tundra looks like. And one of the things that's really interesting about Churchill is there's this tongue of tundra, or Arctic tundra, that creeps down the coast of Hudson Bay. So Churchill's actually located at about 58.5 degrees north. So that's why we sort of caveat and say it's subarctic, but we do have open Arctic tundra, and this is what it looks like in the summertime. In the background of the photo, you can see the ice on Hudson Bay. So this is looking out towards Hudson Bay with a few of our tundra friends, some caribou hanging around. It's not just about polar bears. So in the wintertime, the snowpack on the tundra is very shallow, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But just to give you a sense of what the tundra looks like in the wintertime. And in the background of this photo, you can actually see some trees poking up there. And Steve mentioned tree islands. There's islands of trees, or groups of trees, in a sea of tundra. And then we move from the tundra with those islands of trees in it into the forest. And this is the northern edge of the boreal forest. This is a white spruce forest, so it's very dry in the bottom. You can see there's a lot of caribou lichen in the bottom, and very much an open woodland, only about 20% canopy cover in the forest. And in the wintertime, it has that nice, deep, fluffy snow. This is an example of one of our winter Earthwatch volunteers digging a snow pit to do the snowpack analysis in the forested sites. So on top of that, or thinking about that tree line transition zone and how a changing climate might affect tree line, there's also a large, extensive wetland system called the Hudson Bay Lowlands. And it's the second largest contiguous wetland on the face of the planet. The first one is actually in Siberia, another subarctic and Arctic area. Now that's where my interest lies, is looking at a lot of these shallow tundra ponds. And this is a view from a helicopter to give you a sense what 20 to 40% of the landscape being covered by wetlands really means. And you can also see in this picture the complex dynamic on the landscape as well. There's even a few trees for Steve in this picture as well, and a little bit of snow in those trees. So those are some of the really important or interesting components that we've been studying in this particular project. So I'm just going to put up a more local map to show you a bit more about the project area, and then we're going to go into some results, give you a sense of what we've been up to. So if you'll notice, Churchill is located in the north part of this map. There is a national park very close to us as well, where we also have research stations. And then you've got the Hudson Bay Lowlands there in green, to give you an idea of how extensive those lowlands are. And then you'll notice that blue dashed line on there. And that's a line that designates the continuous permafrost. So above that line would be continuously frozen ground underneath. So permafrost is another important picture of the project, which Steve has briefly mentioned, and we're not going to talk too much more about today. We couldn't shove our whole project into 20 minutes as much as we tried.
Okay, and so much like we can't talk about everything, we also can't measure everything. So we pick a number of what seem to be keystone variables across the landscape that we study from year to year, and we're developing this baseline to which to compare changes that we'll see in the future to the conditions we have today. So one of the main things we do in the wintertime are snowpack measurements. So here's an idea of what that entails. We're standing around outside. We got a snow core there, so that's used to, you plump it down into the snow, and you pull out a known volume, and then you weigh it, and you know the density, and you can calculate cool things like resistance to heat loss, so you know how insulating that snowpack is. And then in areas, this is a great example. It's actually very dry in Churchill, but
it's a dry cold, honest. Minus
yeah,
40 is a dry cold.
Spoken like a true Canadian. Anybody? Okay, good. So this is in a tree island, and so this is where there's a lot of snow trapping. So while only say half a meter of precipitation falls for the whole year, this is actually just about 3 meters of snow because it gets blown by the wind and then trapped by the trees. So some results of that. This is a graph of just a few of the ecosystems that we monitor. We've got snow depth here on the Y, and then each of the different colors is a different site. And then we've got years for some sites starting in 2004 going all the way to 2014, so this year's data. And it's sort of an exposure gradient where you go from forested areas, there's a wetland in there, to tundra with sort of tree line in between. And what we see in that these areas that are forested, if you remember that photo that LeeAnn showed, there was somebody shoveling the snow and they were throwing it. It was just fluffy. It was like sugar. It was not hard and packed at all. So that's a very sheltered, wind-free environment. So you don't have a lot of variation from year to year and among the different sites. If you're in a forest, you have fairly consistent snow depths from year to year. And then when you get into more exposed areas, like this fen is a type of wetland, and there's a lot of low-lying vegetation that can trap some snow. You get shallower snow depths, and then into the tundra, where the vegetation is very stunted. It's almost snow-free, and it's actually snow-free in some places. But then in between, where you have your island in a sea of tundra, where you can get a lot of wind and a lot of snow being blown along, you get these very deep snow depths and a lot of variation. You can see that some of the pits are on the order of a meter, and others are almost 3 meters within this snowpack. So yeah, one of the things that's really coming out is that there's variation. So we also study tree line, and spring shots are always some of my favorites because the rhododendrons are out. You can see all these little purple guys. And yeah, I got enough time. Just as an aside, my first rhododendron I ever saw was in the Arctic, and so I expected them to be these little stunted guys. And then I come to Boston and see these enormous things that are taller than I am. And it's so, what? That's not a rhododendron. It's not this big, but I guess it's all your frame of reference. So we study tree line, and one thing that we're focusing on now is actually the most young individuals. This is a first-year seedling, so it's about that big. So that's where those big trees start out. And so some of my PhD work, what I found was that you can use, so stepping back a sec, you can use tree rings. This is a big tree core here. That's actual size. No, it's not. This has been blown up. So you can see the center of the tree, and there's all these rings that we can measure, and we can do some fancy stats and standardize that and get this dimensionless index of tree growth, which you see here. And so we've got temperature up here. This is June through September. This is growing season, essentially. And we've got our nice S-shaped curve that we've all grown to know and love. And sort of at the same time, we've got 3 different species. We've got larch in green, white spruce in blue, and black spruce in red. And you can see that in this little blip of warm in the mid-20th century, we have increased growth for all species. And then it gets a bit cooler, and we have decreased growth, and then it gets a bit warmer. And we see some increase in spruce. And this is a typically spruce-dominated landscape, but in the last 30 years, we see a lot more larch. And those larch are actually growing much faster. So, and actually, this kind of growth is something we haven't seen in centuries. It's just, they're growing so fast. So in addition to growth, we can look at tree demographics as well. So we've got our same temperature record, just with a different average fit to it. And then again, we've got the number of larch in green, number of white spruce in blue, and number of black spruce in black. And we can see some overlap between this warm period and recruitment, or seeing more individual trees for spruce. But then in recent years, what we really see is that larch takes off. So we're seeing much more larch than we've seen in a few centuries. So this is really interesting because we're going from what used to be predominantly spruce. You read the tree line literature from Churchill from 30 years ago, and you see virtually no mention of larch, to you go there in the fall and the whole landscape is yellow because you see all these yellow larch trees. So we're seeing species-specific responses to the recent warming. We're also seeing variability across the landscape. So we've got, these are age structures. So these are 10-year bins of how many trees in each bin. And we've got forest samples, ecotone, so in between the forest and tundra, and then specifically tree islands, and then we've got temperature again. And we see there are recruitment pulses in the past, and they actually are coincident between ecotone and tree islands, but what I want you to take away from this is that a lot of the most recent recruitment that we're seeing is actually in these tree islands. So within the transition area between forest to tundra is where we're actually seeing some of the big changes in most recent times. And so here's just an example of some of the composition across the landscape. So this is a black spruce forest in the background here. These are some Earthwatchers that were here this June. And then you see all this lighter green stuff. That's all larch, and that's all 20 to 30 years old. And so this actually highlights something interesting, is because this is a disturbance. And so there was vegetation there. It's been taken off for, say, getting gravel. And now you're seeing a whole bunch of larch come in. And so this would have been black spruce, but because there was disturbance and it's warmer, you get larch coming in and taking over. And so we want to tease out some of these mechanisms that might be a hindrance to tree line actually moving onto tundra. So we've done all these observational studies, and those have given us some answers, but we've given us lots of questions too. So to address that, we've included this it's called the Global Tree Line Range Expansion Experiment, where we're using an experimental approach to try and tease out some limiting factors to tree line advance. So we've got a control. So this is just a picture of the vegetation, and this is a 50 by 50 plot where we've got a control, one where we scrape off the vegetation, simulating a disturbance, and then we've got disturbed, and then we've actually put seed on it, and then just a seeded plot. So this is where we really want to get at some of the mechanisms underlying the patterns that we're seeing across the landscape.
So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the wetland component of the project, and what I'm going to do is use an example from the 2014 season just to give you an idea of the wealth of data that we're able to collect in Churchill using citizen scientists. So here's a couple photographs of some of the citizen science in action. We put them in these lovely, fancy, matching brown neoprene waders, and off we go into wetlands, training them how to find some of the creatures and also measure water chemistry and take water samples in the wetlands. So let's just meet a few of the inhabitants of the wetland. So we would go to a wetland like this, and we'd be looking for some of the small creatures. The one on the far left is actually a rotifer, so it's smaller. You wouldn't be able to see that with your eye. But some of these other ones, just to the right, zooplankton, copepods, and daphnia, you can actually see those, and we can field ID those. And then you also have resting stages. These are daphnia resting stages, Aphippia. So we find those in the wetlands, and then also some of the higher trophic levels as well. So a couple of the ones that we're really interested in are the two species of frogs that are in Churchill, mostly frogs they're right at the edge of their geographic distribution. They don't go much farther north than here, at least along the coast of Hudson Bay, and also the two species of small sticklebacks that live in these wetlands as well. So we can introduce these to the citizen scientists, teach them how to identify them, and then we head out into the field and visit about 20 wetlands. Next. Sorry. So each of these little boxes that you're looking at is one wetland. So you can see the numbers across the top. So with a team of roughly 10 volunteers over 10 days, we visit 20 wetlands in total. And we did this in 2014 with 5 different teams. June, 2 in July, 1 in August, and 1 in September. And this shows actually the upper trophic. So you're looking here at the species composition of frogs, or frog tadpoles, and also fish. And what I really want you to take away from this is we looked at 20 wetlands, and just looking at the bars there, you can see that there's quite a bit of variation across the wetlands. So one of the questions we have is about geographic variation of these wetlands. The second thing that's overlain is you can see that the bars change size and also change color often as we go from time step to time step. So not only is there a change in space, but there's a change in time. And this is a piece of work that I would never be able to do on my own, to be able to head out into these wetlands 5 times during the season and be able to collect. This is just the upper trophic. We have this for inverts, we have this for water quality, we have this for stress hormones. And just being able to collect that wealth of information is so powerful in terms of one year of data that we can then insert into our long-term monitoring of these wetlands over time. And the other thing that we do is, much like Steve just mentioned, it's great to do long-term monitoring, and it's one of the things we really appreciate Earthwatch supporting our project for 15 years, is having long-term monitoring, and you've heard that story a couple times already, but using experiments to try to get at those process questions or the mechanisms. So this was our summer experiment that we jokingly called barfing in buckets. So we use 110-gallon stock tanks, bought them at the hardware store. They got brought in on the train to Churchill, and we lined them all up and made wetlands, made our own artificial wetlands. And then we can do similar things in each one, a starting point, and then do manipulations to try to understand things like how might temperature control the survival of tadpoles and the growth rate of tadpoles? How does drying? We expect that these shallow tundra wetlands are going to dry with climate change and hydro periods are going to change. Is there an environmental cue for some of these upper level predators in the wetlands? So this is just some quick results from our 2013 experiment. These enclosures, we were looking at 2 things, a 2x2 factorial design. The first thing was, what happens if you put a fish in with a bunch of tadpoles? And what happens if you put different densities of tadpoles? So if you look at the red bars on the right, I think you're all fairly still awake, I think. It looks like if you put fish in with tadpoles, not as many of them survive. Right? Everyone nod your head? Yeah, you're awake? Okay, good. Good, very good. But you start to look at it. Now you say, okay, so we've got 50 tadpoles versus 100 tadpoles. The survival rate when you put 100 tadpoles in is better, even if you have a fish in that particular experiment. So trying to really understand, confounding factors. How does density of an organism also affect predators? And it's probably a case of, if you're a fish, a little stickleback, you can only eat tadpoles when they're small. So if there's lots of them around, you can only eat so many of them, and then at some point in time, you can't open your mouth any bigger. So you can't eat the tadpoles that are bigger than how big you can open your mouth. So they survive. Okay, so it's trying to understand and get at some of those research questions using these experimental approaches.
All right, so we're wrapping up, finally. We saw some signs going up. We can't... Okay, so one of the things we've seen is that, indeed, air temperatures are warming, and this is having effects across the landscape, but just one of the effects we've shown is that this warming is felt at different extents in different ecosystems. So air temperature is fairly consistent across the landscape, but subsurface is quite variable, and that could have implications for permafrost. And again, hammering that variability point home, is that the snowpack response is quite variable, and it's quite dependent on wind, and it's also quite dependent on vegetation. Because remember that big blip with tree islands? They act like these big nets that catch the snow. Tree line, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on at tree line. I'm a bit biased, so I'll try to keep it down to these 2. That we're seeing 2 what? Oh,
2 points.
Okay. We're seeing species-specific recruitment, so we're seeing some change in spruce, but the biggest change we're seeing is a dramatic increase in the growth and recruitment of larch. And then across the landscape, there's certain hot spots that we see for this sort of change, that you've got these tree islands that are in the sea of tundra, but that's where all the tree recruitment is occurring in these sort of clear areas. And so that's where we expect could be a nucleus for further tree line expansion.
And lastly, for wetlands, the really important components are that environmental control on species, so that wetlands vary in time and space, and it's really important to address both of those. And also thinking about interactions of predators in these wetlands.
Okay, so I think we'll hammer out one last bullet point, is that we collect a lot of data across a lot of landscapes at a bunch of different times during the year, every year. And if it was just LeeAnn and I out there, we would not be able to do it. So this is where we really value the support that we get from Earthwatch and folks like you that have come on these expeditions and contribute to the data collection so that we can look all fancy. Oh, look at what we found up in the Arctic. It's pretty cool. So we thank you for being involved. And if you haven't been involved yet, you should get involved because it's super cool. And this, this could be you. Watching LeeAnn eat a sandwich. Nobody eats it. Just kidding. All right, thank you.